Thanks for having me. How's everybody doing tonight?
Great.
Cool. Everybody has a beer? I have one. It's a nighttime talk, so cheers to everyone. I've lived in Austin for about 4 years, and for those 4 years, I never really did a talk in Austin. I'd fly around the world and do talks, but it's probably my 10th talk I've done this year. I'm just saying yes to everything. We live in a crazy world, and there's been a lot of opportunities and a lot of energy here, and there's some familiar faces in the audience, so thank you all for coming, and I'm really excited to share some of my work with you, get your feedback. Let's have a good conversation tonight after, and see what kind of ideas emerge from tonight. And thanks to the host here at 1323 for having me out. Very, very happy to be here. So my talk is called "The Future as a Cognitive Prosthetic." It's an idea that I've been working on for a while now, and I would still consider this a work in progress. I'm still filtering through these ideas with some examples of what I've done and trying to really make sense of how we think about the future, where we might get derailed from thinking about the future effectively, and how to improve that so we can build better futures together. Let's see. Oops. I'm going to get this right. Here, we're going to go down. So just a little bit, thanks Scott for the introduction. I work in governance design, neuropolitics, so looking at how our understanding of the brain changes our political systems, our power dynamics, our relationships with each other, and then also experiential futures, which some may know as, there's overlap, these aren't exactly the same terms, but design fiction, design futures, those kind of ideas are all enmeshed in this idea of building prototypes, building media that represents and embodies different kinds of futures. So we'll have questions at the end, but if there's any kind of more clarifying questions along the way, please don't hesitate to jump in. So why think about the future? This is kind of the meta story here, why we do this, why we do what we do. This is one of my favorite quotes from a guy named Tom Atlee. He says, things are getting better and better, worse and worse, faster and faster. And so we can understand, I think, the first two parts of that. The last part, I think, is the most important part, at least for how we think about the future and how we're going to respond to it effectively. Things are moving faster and faster, and we often can't keep up with the changes. I mean, this week feels like a slow news week. I mean, kind of, right? I mean, compared to last week. So I think we all live this now. This used to be something that we would talk to business leaders or government officials or people working in intelligence, and they would get it. I think every individual, maybe on the planet, feels this in a way that we haven't before. I think it's unprecedented. So we're dealing with, future shock in a way, what Toffler was talking about. I think we're all dealing with it on an almost individual daily basis. And there are some repercussions for that, and we can talk about that too as well. And then another inspirational touch point for me is Bucky Fuller's idea that we are called to be architects of the future, not as victims. So we can actually do something about it. Even with all this turbulence, all this change, we're not going to be perfectly controlling this, but we can get better and become better architects of the future. So in that vein, this idea that where humans are, where are we right now? And the dinosaurs are extinct because they didn't have a space program. Humans are developing the capacity to actually overcome potentially an existential threat of asteroid impact. This is an amazing accomplishment for a species, for an intelligent species, and an amazing accomplishment for humanity. This is the NASA Asteroid Challenge, so trying to seek out and identify asteroid threats to human populations. That's a crowdsourced attempt to do that. So an amazing sensing capacity that we've built on this planet, and maybe we'll avoid the fate of the dinosaurs, which is nice. But what if we're the dinosaurs? What if we might be, but what if we're the asteroid, right? Well, that's to be determined, right? But what if we are the asteroid, right? What if we are the prime mover of existential threat? How do we deal with that? I think it's a lot easier to deal with an asteroid threat than it is to deal with our own problems, ways that we've organized society. That could be a much thornier problem to deal with. This is a great example of this. This is Bruce Wilkinson, a geologist. We're basically planet eaters at this point of our existence, and humans are an order of magnitude more important at moving sediment on the face of the earth than the sum of all other natural processes operating. So we see this. We don't even have to look at hard data. We can see this visually, viscerally, that we are literally planet eaters, planet destroyers, and planet growers too, right? I mean, we're cultivators of a garden as well. So thinking about the metaphors we use is really important. But just basically saying that it's our responsibility to take action, and we need to do something about that. And as Sandy Pentland says, where do we focus our attention on the problem? The biggest problem may not be global warming, may not be war, it's we don't know how to manage ourselves. And I tend to agree with that. Yeah. That we have to find a way to live as 7+ billion people on this planet in a way that doesn't destroy us and the rest of, the planet will be fine, it'll recover. But civilizationally, the trajectory of human change, we need to get better at it. And that's, again, the kind of meta stakes that are involved in the work that we do. Now, foresight is a big part of this. In my opinion, the ability to look ahead, and this is my metaphor for our limited capacity to do foresight. It's one of the core human traits, but we tend to not do it very well. Or that's the provocative way. We may say that we don't do it as well as we could. But this is have you seen this before? This is a parishioner in Borja, Spain, took it upon herself to restore this fresco of Jesus. And that's the result there on the right. So, everyone can be an art restorer, and just not everyone does it as well as others. So what I'm arguing for, part of my life's work, is to give people some structures, some scaffolding for thinking about the future more usefully. There are tools and techniques from the field of future studies and foresight that are going on 60, 70 years now that we really don't encounter very often. It's coming. I think it's coming into vogue. I think we're seeing the need for it, but often we don't have that kind of training. Had any of you taken a futures or foresight class or course? Right. How many of you had a history class? Right, which is great, because history is not the enemy of the future, but we need to run the tape forward. We need to be able to understand how to think ahead more effectively. And so, again, that's part of the crux of what I think my work's about, but also what I think our culture needs to be able to survive and thrive more effectively. Here are some of our limitations. All right, I mentioned neuropolitics, so I'm really interested in what brain science is telling us about how we think and how we're rational and irrational at times, and some of our limitations, right? That it's not our fault. So if we don't think about the future very well, it's not necessarily our fault. We have inherited a kind of thinking from evolution and the way our brain is structured that lends to certain kinds of thinking as opposed to others. So this bit of research is really interesting, showing that when we imagine our future selves, say 10 years out, our brain works as if that's a stranger. So all those 3 lines there are talking about other people. Sorry, the blue line in the middle here is our future self. So you see the pattern looks like if we're thinking about another person, right? These are other people. So our brain lights up when we think about ourselves, our current selves, but when we think about our future selves, it looks like a stranger. The patterns of thinking feel and look like we're thinking about somebody else. So it's hard, and they've done studies about people putting away retirement income or health choices. If you think the person in the future is not you, if you don't have an emotional connection to that, then it's harder for you to bridge that abstraction to actually make decisions for that person because it doesn't feel like you. Yeah.
Yeah. So what does that graph represent? So you have all the blue, orange.
Yeah. This is activation of the medial prefrontal cortex, which is the.
And that's represented in yellow?
That's the purple here. Yeah, right here is the part of the brain. So the purple is activating when we think about ourselves. It's firing. When we think about others, it doesn't fire. This white part is the main activation.
Okay, the brain usually moves where it fires around base more or less. So where does it move when you think about others? You're describing there.
Right. So in this study, it's showing you the medial prefrontal cortex fires when we're thinking about ourselves, does not fire to that degree when we're thinking about others. So that's the main takeaway from this. So, and the future itself is an abstraction, right? I mean, future selves are, but the future itself, it doesn't exist. That's why this field is quite interesting, is there are no future facts. So what we're trying to understand is this inherent abstraction, and how do we create a relationship with something that's inherently abstract, where that abstraction makes a difference to the kind of decision-making processes that we have. And that applies personally, we'll talk about, and also socially. Here's another interesting bit of research showing that when we think about ourselves in the far future, and by their terms, that's 10 years out, when we think about ourselves in the near term, we think about ourselves in the first person. We imagine ourselves looking through our own eyeballs at the world. When we imagine in the far future, we have an abstracted view. We look at it from a third person point of view. So we're looking down on ourselves as we do. And it's the same if we're talking about a friend here. So they're both thinking about a friend in a space from a third person point of view. We tend to go in that direction for the far future when we do that as well. So again, just another bit of research showing that our future selves we don't feel like they're us, and that has an impact. Another bit of research really telling is that we think about the future when we imagine future scenarios, future situations. We use a lot of the same parts of our brain. It's a lot of the same systems in our brain as we do when we recall the past. So we have kind of a baked-in system that projects forward based on our prior experience. So we're using a lot of those same parts of our brain. Therefore, if we are running into things that are consistent and relatively stable and linear, that's great because our systems work to understand that linear projection and we can go forward. But if things are turbulent, disruptive, nonlinear, then the patterns of using the past as a prologue to the future become problematic. And we tend potentially to have blind spots and we miss things that happen. So we need to harness this system. And we need to create, in some ways, artificial experiences of the future so that we can tune our neurons to prepare, to be able to see, to make it thinkable and seeable to do that. So this is what we've inherited. And so the idea of a cognitive prosthetic is that we build out from that inheritance a way of harnessing that system to make us more effective, to see and imagine different kinds of futures than possibly we could have before, and to care about that. You know, as Lewis Carroll said it more pithily, it's a poor sort of memory that only works backwards. No. So we need to harness those memory systems. Those are all actually, I shouldn't call them memory systems, they're actually part of a memory prospection system that work together in harmony. So I think they're both there. Both of those systems exist, and I wouldn't put a primacy on the memory part because I think the prospection part maybe is what we evolved for as well. Just some other bits of information. I don't want to overload you with this, but it's just amazing how much research has come in the last few years to really backfill some of the intuitions that we had as design futurists and social scientists about how do you make people care about the future. In this case, some research showing that they found the places where we actually put the emotion into the scenario, where we care about it. So the ventral medial prefrontal cortex is the spot that fires when we actually try to imagine a future scenario, whether we're going to be happy or upset, or the emotional valence of that. And so we're beginning to find, we know to get in the weeds of this, but just pointing this out, that we're beginning to find the mechanisms of how our brains actually work to think about the future, where we get caught up, where our biases are, and how do we, again, harness those or leverage those for our purposes. And then from that article, this is just a good takeaway of, again, why we've evolved this. By encoding imagined scenarios into long-term memory, we can use our prior simulations at later time points so that they can substitute for real experiences. So we need that. We need to be able to be rehearsing future situations. It's one of the main qualities, I think, of the human mind, is to be able to do that. And the stakes are lower when you imagine, if you imagine going into a situation and talking to someone and being extremely embarrassed or awkward, you might that emotional connection might make you go prepare more for that, or it might make you react in a different way. Or if something is dangerous, if you're walking into a really dangerous situation and you've played it before in your mind, you might be able to avoid some negative outcomes of that. So these are the mechanisms that are working all along. The spatial part of it as well. So you'll see how this stuff is synthesized as we bring it all together in the work. But episodic memory, spatial navigation, imagination, and future thinking all are using parts of our brain that also are involved in creating spatially coherent scenes and moving through space. So there's hippocampal mechanisms going on, but we need to feel a sense of space. So when we do visioning, when we, often futurists will do visioning, or others as well, trying to create the idea of put yourself, on a beautiful beach and really imagine the waves and really imagine how it feels. That idea of a spatial feeling to that, of actually putting yourself in there, is critically important for you to be able to imagine more effectively yourself in that situation. And then it gets even more complex, because I've been talking about the inside stuff, but the external stuff is really complicated as well. So there's not one future that we can lock onto. As futurists, we're not trying to predict a single future. We're looking at this range of possible futures, all the branching decisions and interaction of trends and events that happen that give us this cone, this space of possibility of which our action takes place. So we're trying to understand coherently, not infinite numbers, but what are major sets of plausible directions of change that we can encounter and understand. Yeah.
Do you run any of these psychological research on chess players?
Gary Kasparov is very reflexive on his thinking. Yeah, I mean, you look at different scenarios. And imagine how complex that is with, what is it, 32 pieces, 64 spots on there, finite rules. And once you have 3 or 4 moves, it's in the billions of how many possibilities exist there. So imagine the complex world we live in. It's tough, right? Yeah.
What is the significance that your graph seems to have so much time symmetry? It does make a difference to go forward or backwards once you map it out.
Yeah, so it's not completely symmetrical, but at every moment in time there are possibilities that are deleted, right? That whatever happens is the point that happens, and so this would continually be moving over time. So every possibility in this, for me moving here or here, is a possibility at some point. And as we get closer to the present, those are less, there are more limited numbers of those. But at each point now, there's a set of possibilities that exist from that point out in the future. So that's where that history goes. Yeah.
Here we are talking about past and future, but what present? What parts of our brains are used for determining what we have to do right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the motor systems, it's the attentional systems that we have. I mean, if we're daydreaming, it would be the default network. So yeah, all of those things. Right now, our attention is very visual. I'm listening to you. I'm thinking, about words and all of that. So what's booted up right now is all of our very much front stage attentional systems. Yeah.
I talk to some people in the tech field, tech industry. I'm not in the tech industry, but I attend a lot of these presentations. I talk with people who are developers of AI, and most of them don't want to believe that AI will rub us out. Although that seems like a lot of people's prognostication. People who aren't invested in doing that as a career. How do you see that people's careers or their political views influence the way they choose to envision the future?
Oh yeah, it's huge. I mean, our beliefs about the future definitely influence that. Let's park that for a second. We'll have time for longer ones. Let me get through some of these, because I think some of the questions hopefully will be addressed, and then we can go deeper as we go forward. So here's our dilemma, right? We often feel disempowered when we think about the future. It's tough, right? It's with all those branching options, with the threats that we see, personal threats of jobs or politics that are happening. So the vision, the values, the images we have about the future absolutely influence our decisions, how we think about it, how we react to it at a personal level, but also at a societal level and a political level as well. So this is our enemy, is the disempowerment of feeling like you're incapable of addressing the future in some productive way. And so we're working on trying to find ways to address that need. This just came out last week, a New York Times, highly recommend it, from a couple of psychologists. Just showed that depressed people, it's not really the past that's the trouble, it's imagining the future. And so they're distinguished from the norm by their tendency to imagine fewer positive scenarios while at the same time overestimating future risk. So there's just a sense of dread and avoidance that happens for those that are depressed. And I think we've all felt that at some point, right, in different situations. But that's one of the qualities of that is They make a point of it. It's less about the past trauma and more about the dread of uncertain futures or negative futures. And this goes for, potentially, goes for cultures as well. So this is some pioneering work from a sociologist, a Dutch sociologist named Fred Polak. And he studied images of the future. The book is called The Image of the Future in past civilizations, and looked at art, poetry, writing, and he saw some patterns. You could go dive in and test him on it historically, but his argument is that the rise and fall of images of the future precedes or accompanies the rise and fall of cultures. As long as a society's image is positive and flourishing, the flower of culture is in full bloom. Once the image begins to decay and lose its vitality, the culture does not long survive. So how do we feel? What does it feel like in the US right now, right? Troublesome, right? But go to a place like China, and the vision of the future is still very positive. Or there's other places around the world that I've traveled to, and they feel like things are on the up. Colombia, another place. Very positive image of the future. So if Polak is to be believed, it's not just personal depression, it's almost a cultural tendency where their outcomes could potentially be negative based on the predominant images of the future that exist. Yeah.
I'm curious what you think the cause-effect relationship is here. Is it that the future is bad and therefore cultural images of the future become bad, or is it the other way around?
Yeah, so he was mostly descriptive in a way, but I think he was also saying that, he says that they precede or accompany. So he's a little looser on that, but part of...
William Gibson is what you're saying.
Yeah, well, part of his argument too is to get in there and engineer it, right? I mean, to come up, if there's no positive image of the future of your society or yourself, just like the depression slide quote, just it follows logically, right? That what are you going to build? What are we going to build if there's not an America that we want to live in, right? I mean, so you don't want to be, yeah. Well, I mean, that's Mars as the backup Earth, right? I mean, that's an image of the future for sure. But is that compelling enough to pull society toward? Maybe so, with somebody like Elon Musk behind it. But okay, so right, this stuff matters. And then this fiction writer puts it very well as well. Stories have the power to liberate us from the tyranny of what was and what is. So this is our chance to break through, to stop that pattern of futures imagining that only relies on things that we've experienced in the past, to really expand our horizons, to pre-experience, to pre-feel possible futures. I think it's a liberating process and a potentially politically powerful one, and a personally powerful one as well. And then my colleague at the Institute for the Future, Jane McGonigal, has been doing a lot of work in this area as well, really synthesizing some of the personal futures part of it. And she says, when you can imagine concrete details of a possible future, this is where we'll shift into the experiential part, it's easier to close the future gap and put yourself in that future. So easier to close the gap between this abstract person or this stranger that you think your future self is, when you can imagine specific concrete details, when you can really get the specifics of that. Call it specificity induction in the literature, really trying to imagine the feel, the details of a situation. Future you becomes less of a stranger and someone you can actively conspire on behalf of to create a better world and a better life. So I like that idea of conspiring with your future self to be the person you want, to put money away for your future self, to eat better for your future self. These techniques, I think, are critical for doing that, and we can project forward for society as well. And I think that's a lot of my public work is done that. So the takeaway from this part of the talk is how we think and feel about the future matters. Futures, plural, matters. These things have a material effect on our decisions, our policies, how we interact with each other, what kind of actions we take in the present, and what kind of futures we ultimately build. And my argument with the work I've done in experiential futures is that in order to make new futures thinkable and actionable, we need to consciously create, design, and unleash a wide range of possible futures into the present and make those possible futures full-bodied experiences. So we need to, I've shown a lot of neural images, but I think about ourselves as an embodied mind and an extended mind. So when we interact on the mind, it's our bodies, it's our guts, it's our emotional centers, it's our brains, it's the things around us, the architecture, the artifacts that we build. All of that is the mind that we're acting on, and try to make that a full-bodied, fully felt experience. And So for the rest of the talk, we'll talk about some examples of how I've done that in my work, what it looks like in practice, some of the outcomes that come of that, and then we can have some more questions. So experiential futures is what I and my colleague, especially Stuart Candy, and I call it. This is the idea that we experience different stories, different scenarios. There's certainly design involved in that. I'm not a designer. I'm a social scientist by training, an anthropologist and political scientist. So I'm coming at it from that. What is the experience of living in a place? Not just what the designed artifact is, which is important. We build those. We certainly make things tangible. But it's really coming from the experience first. What do we need to craft in a performance, in media, in the feeling of a space to help us leap forward and time travel into the future, or you might look at it differently, fold the future back onto us now so that we can de-abstractify the future and have that connection, have that feeling and emotional connection to that abstract world. So I'm going to go through some examples of this work that I've done over the years. This was one of the first ones that, the big one that kind of kicked off our thinking in this. We did this for the state of Hawaii, and they were doing a follow-up to the Hawaii 2000 project that they did in the late 60s, early 70s, where they were imagining different possible futures of Hawaii. By the time 2000 came around, they were living in the worst scenario that they had imagined in the 70s, the early 70s. Traffic, it was tourism and military. It was very fragile kind of economic drivers. It looked like California. There was no sense of place. These were some of the feedback, the kind of images that people were saying that Hawaii at that point was. So they wanted to say, oh, let's get it right this time. Let's really try to project forward to 2050. Let's create a sustainable Hawaii. Let's do this again and do it better. So there's a lot more to that story, but for the kickoff of that initiative, we created 4 alternative futures of Hawaii. One that was a kind of continued growth story, one that was a collapse or post-collapse story, one that was kind of a discipline back to old Hawaii where everything was more locally run, and another one that was a transformation. So this is your AI upload post-human world. So we gave them, the 600 people that came to this, we had them experience each of these, and then had a long workshop after that to process, okay, what actual future of Hawaii do you want? Because if you just ask people what they want, they're going to give you either trite or narrow or, again, going back to some of those things, just things that they've heard before. So we really wanted to provoke people to get them out of their habitual ways of thinking and then come back to that question. And I think it was successful, and we had a lot more creative responses to that. Quickly.
In terms of what you did, was it immersive experiences that they did?
Yeah, so they walked in. So here's one of our examples. This was the continued growth story. So people came in. We had divided into 4, so it's about 150 people, and they were told that they were electors to a government election for the governor of Hawaii. And so this was a debate, the final debate between 2 candidates for governor of Hawaii. And these 2 candidates in 2050 were actually corporations. As legal persons could now run for office as corporations. They just cut out the middleman and said, okay, we're just gonna be the elected official. So they could run as legal persons. So through the auspices of the debate, we had the issues that were coming up. So one was Aloha Nuclear and Water. So you can imagine some nuclear power and desal. They're kind of the old incumbent energy sector. And the other one was Kobayashi Virtual Concern. They were a designing and gaming firm that had created an algorithm that took the best of historical leaders and basically they were going to run the state using the best qualities of historical leaders into a certain kind of governing algorithm. So that was really kind of fun. This is now going on 10 years ago, so I think we got a lot right. Citizens United might have sped up our timeline on that a little bit, so this was before that. So that was what they came in, and then they had the debate, and then they voted at the end. Another one was a collapse story where Hawaii had become a military dictatorship after a climate change, environmental collapse. So it was run as basically a dictatorship, military with Hawaiian value dictatorship, but people when they came in, they were made to know that they were climate refugees coming from flooded Micronesian islands. And it was an induction ceremony. So you're basically a citizen soldier in Hawaii. And they were shown what are all the rules of this society. You have to take an oath to the king. They were given their military, brief military training. These are like 20, 30-minute experiences each. So you got a little flavor of that, and you experience multiple futures of Hawaii. And then, again, as I said, we had a long, fruitful discussion after that. So that was kind of the kickoff in a contained space. Now, from there, we've done all kinds of different things. This is going to be more of a survey of different ideas, projects that we've done. This one was in Chinatown in Honolulu, where we created, in this case, we had 3 different futures of Chinatown that just showed up on the streets. So that one was in a convention center. This one just emerged guerrilla style on the streets of Honolulu, Chinatown, one at a time. So one future would just happen. The first one we did was a gentrification story. So we had been talking to this is kind of an arts district as well. So we were talking to the artists, gallery owners, the Chinese merchants, all the restaurant owners. And one of their biggest fears was that Chinatown would become no place. It would just have chain stores and Starbucks, and it would just lose its sense of place. And that was very important to people. So, this was over a course of a long time, several months of work and research. So one First Friday, which is the art walk in Chinatown, they got their gentrification story back to them as if it was real. So every empty building had coming soon Starbucks or American Apparel. So here's the TGI Fridays coming on those walls. So we put up, we worked with designers. We put up very official looking signs on every empty building, and luxury lofts up there. And so people bought it. I mean, that was our purpose. So we, working kind of edgy there, right? I mean, it was a bit of a hoax, but also with a purpose. We staged the protest against the gentrification as well the same night. So we played both sides of that. And we had websites for the development company, very little writing on some of the signs. But if people went and Googled that, they would find a backstory of that. So we had multiple layers of this, which is how we like to work. We like to reward multiple levels of engagement. So if somebody really wants to dive in, there's stuff for them there. But if somebody just walks by, and they'll get something out of that as well. So we staged both sides of this. And the same people, this is what really confirmed it, the same people that we talked to that were saying, I don't want Starbucks, when they thought it was coming, we heard things like, that building's been empty for several years, or the foot traffic will improve down this street, or, I like coffee, it's great, whatever. But because they believed it, and this is what we do every moment, November 9th or whatever, we wake up and we say, okay, this is our reality, and we have to deal with it the best we can. So that's what they were doing. But when we ask them in the abstract, the answers are totally different. When you ask them when they believe it's true, totally different story. So that was really eye-opening. I mean, that was our kind of background humming theory that we had, but also just confirmed that people, as an anthropologist, also people will tell you one thing, but when they actually are acting and living, it may look totally different. And so this was really effective in that sense. So that was on the street. We did another one. On a bird flu outbreak that had this. So this was a year late after the bird flu outbreak. We weren't trying to yell fire in a theater. But so we had a memorial plaque to the people who had died and were missing from the bird flu. It was really fun. So when you're working on the streets, there's a lot of ambient interactions that happen. So some of the people that live around or the homeless guys really got into it, and they would help us kind of build out the story and would talk about, oh yeah, the weeping spring of 2017. That was crazy. This was 2007, so that was far in the future. And everything said that. We weren't trying to fool people to make people feel foolish. That's not the goal. We're trying to make people not dismiss these possibilities, and that's our enemy is dismissal. And we have a lot of good psychological and cultural techniques for dismissing things that we don't want to or are not prepared to deal with. And then a third one was if Hawaii and China become more tightly wound together, and Hawaii kind of turns its back to the U.S. and begins to create a deeper relationship with China. There's a long history of Chinese immigration, and Sun Yat-sen lived in Hawaii, so we were playing on that. And historical resonances are extremely important. So we did our research. I mentioned we did our kind of ethnographic research, but also our historical research. So there had been 2 plagues in Chinatown, 1887 and 1900. And the whole district had been burned down in 1900. So this was still, for people that had been there generations, it was still part of the fabric of their lives. So these stories, we were sensitive to that. We wanted to play with some of those themes as well, but understanding where these trajectories come from. That's critically important. So we do our historical research to make these effective work and to serve our purpose, which is to help people have better, richer, deeper, more impactful reactions, conversations, and responses to future possibilities. And here, another kind of takeaway for us is it's better to be blindsided by, surprised by a simulation rather than blindsided by reality. So the stakes of learning in a simulated environment are lower cost more often than if things actually happen. So if people really responded negatively to the gentrification story, they could now respond to that, but also they could be more open to it now that instead of stopping something that might improve the district, they now have a different kind of reaction to that. Yeah.
Sort of keying on your word simulation there, I'm curious, you did a lot of these a number of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, with the advances in augmented reality technology, have you thought of actually trying to create simulations?
Yeah, and that's kind of the takeaway at the end. I think that's where we're going. I think virtual reality is a medium that's perfectly set for this kind of imagination. It has a physicality to it. You're moving in space. It's really rich environment, a lot of details. So I think a lot of potential in virtual reality for doing this. Yeah, but this is high effort. I wouldn't say high cost because we always did it on a shoestring, but a lot of work for us to build physical artifacts and to go on the street and to either ask building owners or put stuff up and risk reactions, which we had as well. So yeah, I think virtual reality is a very high potential zone that we're thinking about. Here's just some other artifacts of the ways we work. This was for an art festival in San Jose. We created this, there were several different artifacts, but this one is a civic dashboard. So every morning you wake up, you get your score on how good of a citizen you're being, how healthy you are, how much you're contributing to civic life, your waste and environmental impact. And so you get that every morning, so it's kind of your score. We did this before I don't know if you've seen the Chinese citizenship scores that have been proposed, where your social media streams, your actions, it's like a credit score, but you as a total citizen. So that's something that's a corollary that's happening.
In Black Mirror episode, season 3 episode 1, when Netflix grabbed it, they had a whole thing, the entire society was structured around your social media score.
Yes.
And if it was too low, you couldn't get a job at a certain place.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So nosedive. It's. That's right. Yeah. So every interaction we have, you get a score, just like you would give your Uber driver. I hate using that brand name, but yeah. So this is playing with some of those ideas. So if we're generating data all the time, and that there's a feedback loop for that, how is it going to be used? Either for us, is it going to be sold to advertisers, or we're going to have this dashboard for understanding how well we're doing on a daily basis, and what might governments or those in power use that for? So yeah, this was years before Black Mirror, and it's a mirror. So yeah, we had a few things right. This is a different kind of project, really effective as well. This was more of an art piece, really. This was for World Oceans Day in 2010, which happened to be Jacques Cousteau's 100th birthday. So there was a lot of, this was the California Academy of Science in San Francisco. And we were looking at ocean pollution, plastic pollution in the ocean. So we're trying to represent that. Sorry? Is it gyre or gyre? Is it GIF or GIF? Well, we'll get into that later. So the plastic pollution in the ocean. When I was in Hawaii, I'd see it wash up all the time. So this is something near and dear to my heart. So I worked with marine biologists, artists, my colleague Stuart Candy, and we represented in a visceral and visual way the amount of plastic pollution in the ocean. So we had 1910, which had just one little piece of plastic, basically when plastic was invented, commercial plastic, and Jacques Cousteau's was born that year as well. 1960, 2010, which was the president at the time, and 2030. So just a relative kind of artistic take on that. We also had graphs and things as well, showing the actual tonnage of plastic in the ocean. But that look was everything for us. So instead of just showing graphs or the pictures of the albatrosses with dead of plastic are very evocative and provocative as well. But that look, to say this is not something out there in some abstract, faraway ocean, you'll see the themes, right? Trying to personalize, embody this. The fact that they're water coolers is an invitation for people to come drink out of that and to say, this is part of us. And so the background, the fun artifice of this for us is that those ceramic bottoms could hold water. So they held about 2 gallons of water, and we stopped up the top. So there's like, film canisters and pantyhose and straws and stuff in those. So we would go up and drink it, and if we're drinking fresh water, people just, total disgust. So the emotion of disgust, very effective tool in our toolkit. And so that look of fascination and disgust has in our view, has an effect on people in a different way than maybe more abstract ways of talking about it or other ways. So we find any way to make that connection, to make it matter. That's our goal. And so this one was effective in that sense. Here's another one. As a futurist, the future can catch up with you very quickly. This was a kind of a fake product we created where you could think your thoughts to the internet, called MindWriter, or to your computer. But you see the Google and Facebook logos up there. So if you've seen the F8 discussion recently, that Facebook is working on this direct-to-computer neural interfaces. This was 2012, I believe. So some fun little details. So this is an actual physical package we had at a conference. So it's another media vector that we use. Daydream with confidence. Why give stray thoughts away? This is my favorite part, is this end user license agreement, that the machine will not operate unless it can sense that you've read the end user license agreement. So it knows if you've read it or not, right? You can't just click a button. And the other part of it is that it takes all your intellectual property. There's more fine print to that as well. Here's how we do it. This is a very simplified way that we process our experiential futures. And I won't go into great detail, but it just gives you a sense of how we funnel down into creating the actual stuff. So we start with a setting. Hawaii in 2050. That can come from outside clients or whatever they're working with, or our own initiatives. The scenario. So we always write at least one, often multiple scenarios of the world that we're talking about. So this is the universe, right? We create a universe. This is kind of the part and parcel of futurists, right? Often you see it kind of stopping there at a scenario. That's the story of the world that exists. What are the rules of that world? Who are the main players? Who are the winners and losers? So that's a specific future state. Okay, Hawaii 2050. So a scenario around a post-collapse military dictatorship. That's the story we want to tell for that one. The situation. So okay, you're coming into an induction ceremony as refugees from flooded Pacific Islands. That's the situation. We wrap a story around that. This is going to be a training and induction ceremony part. And then the stuff. So we created flags and military uniforms and buttons and a video showing the history of Hawaii, over the last 40 years. So all the stuff comes out of that. So this was a kind of simplified way for us to just think, what do we need to do in what order in order to come out with the work that we do? And again, all the research, kind of, not talking about all the other research and things. Each one of these stages can be blown out into multiple activities within each one, of course. So I want to end, the last example I want to give is something I did last year in Newport, Rhode Island. So I came in as something called a catalyst in residence for Newport, and what we decided to do was to create, how do you talk about the civic life? What are, if we go back to this, like, okay, Newport in the future, a scenario, so we created one where there's artificial intelligence and of course climate change is happening, but what kind of situation would embody a place where if you went to it, you would really understand what's happening? And a mayor's office, if you ever have been to one, has pictures, flags. It kind of condenses a lot of the story of a place into one location. So we decided to create a mayor's office from the year 2061, and you see that there. So I worked with dozens of people here in Austin. We did some workshopping here and with people on the ground there in Newport to create a fully fleshed out story of Newport from 2016 to 2061 over that time period. And you'll see some of the artifacts here. This is up there in the top is the campaign poster for the artificial intelligence, which had been mayor for 8 years and was doing wonderfully. People loved it. Like real-time taxes, like really responsive kind of activities that a human couldn't do, right? So people loved it, but it began to do some illegal and quasi-illegal activities working with other AI mayors to subvert the law. So it was doing things sort of like the trading algorithms that exist, So it began to do some emergent activities, and so the Supreme Court shut it down. So by that point in 2061, those are old posters. That was like 8 years old from there. So we're thinking about these things and creating the artifacts like that. There's just a bunch of stuff, some newspaper, little products like inhale cigarettes that scrub your lungs. They're healthy cigarettes, so they make, they put nanobots in your lungs to keep your lungs very healthy. One of my favorite artifacts up there in the corner is a signed picture from the 3-time Newport to North Pole yacht race. So there's no ice on the North Pole. There's now a contest to race there. So ways of telling that story without beating people over the head of it. That's kind of the art of this. It's like, okay, yes, there's climate change, there's no ice on the North Pole anymore. How are you going to tell people that? Well, I like doing things like that. So this was taking place in a gas station that had closed down, and it was, of course, a Citgo station right in the middle of town. So you see in the corner, there's the actual first spring of Newport. So this had a really deep connection to the city. So we were really lucky to get that place. It had windows and everything, but they wouldn't let me paint over the Citgo, right? You're breaking my universe, right? This is supposed to be the mayor's office, and it clearly looks like a gas station. So I tried and tried and tried. Here's some of the weeds of actually doing this work. I tried and tried, and they wouldn't ever budge. They kept just deflecting. So I said, okay, how can I create a city government office building? So I just painted a V. It's kind of basically my proudest moment as an experiential futurist. And a person who loves wordplay. I got it, all right? They wouldn't let me paint over it. So city government, we did it, and it worked really well. So this was some artifacts from the Newport Compromise. So Hawaii and Texas had seceded, and the United States was on the verge of breaking down totally in 2030. But the remaining 48 states came together in the Newport Compromise. You see some kids drawing a la the founding of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So it had become an historical event in 2030, and that flag has 48 stars. That was kind of easier to find. We didn't have to fabricate that. So all of these little details. So if somebody wants to come in and just get the story, and it's all raised because sea level rise, so they have to raise things up every once in a while as the storms come in. But they wanted to be hardy and show that they're not going anywhere. So that's why everything is raised off the ground. All of those details, people can really dive into those stories, and that's what we love to do. This is a microbial vault, so you don't just have the seeds like Svalbard in Norway. You actually need the microbiome of Earth to grow plants, so they keep all of the bacteria, Earth's bacterial inheritance there at a very famous building in Newport. And then this was actually a gas station, so we planted marsh plants there in the pit, in the oil pit, and that datum line shows where certain levels of sea level rise, what buildings around town would be flooded by that sea level rise. So it gives you a little bit of a context for that. So as I mentioned, we work together. This is one of my favorite quotes from my colleague and friend Stuart Candy. Imagination is not the product of a single brain. So yeah, we're working on this, but we're always working with history, with people on the ground, with designers that are putting these things together. And so that's how these things come about. So experiential scenarios, experiential futures. I mentioned, I kind of laid out the case why I think they work, and a lot of this is from more recent research even than we've been doing. So it specifies, so it creates actual things that are in the world that you can put your mind around. You can place yourself in that situation. So there's actual things, specific things to make it more concrete. It spatializes. So we're often working in an actual physical space. So you move through that, you have that hippocampal connection to it, and then it personalizes it. So you're actually walking through a space. You are there. You don't have to imagine yourself in the future. You're actually there, even for a short time being. And you can bridge that gap between your current self and your future self. So I think this is why they work so well, and I've seen them be very effective. The kind of conversations that we've had have been very effective. And so getting back, Kevin, a little bit to where I think this is going, virtual reality is going to be a key one. I'm really excited to see what we can do with that. My colleagues at Institute for the Future are working on this. Others are as well. So we'll see, what kind of future worlds that we can create. I think something maybe like Westworld, where we actually live in a rich simulated experience for a period of time. Given hopefully not with the revolutionary murder and rebellion of that, but who knows, right? So maybe it looks something like that. One of my pet ideas is to create a national draft where instead of going into the military, you actually go and simulate policies and different kind of governing structures. So you would go when you're 18 years old, spend a year either as a black hat or a white hat or other, trying to live in a society where, okay, we're going to have direct democracy. What is that? How does that work? Where might it break down? So I would love to see a global simulation core where we play test future possibilities before we actually have to live them. Okay, and then the final takeaway, you have to learn to make the future a more functional extension of ourselves so we can become architects of better futures, and I think that's what this is all about. Thanks. Yeah.
So in one of the earlier slides, you showed that when we think of our near future and the 10-year down the line future, the near thing is we are much more closer to that, but distant future is more we think of it as a different person.
Yeah.
But when you compared it with your friend, it seemed almost the near friend as well as the distant friend looks at the same level. Why is
Go back to that. I have to review that one. Yeah, because that looked different. Yeah, well, that's all right. I need to review that.
Slide that was about being in the third person.
Yeah.
It had bar charts, and for the friend,
Right.
both of them seem to be of equal hand.
Yeah, let me make sure I got that right, because
This one.
So third person.
Why is the friend
Yeah, that's
almost equal, whereas ourselves, like the far person, is much.
Yeah, I think so. It's a really interesting question. I'm not sure why, if you think about your friend in the near term, you're thinking about them I think it's you seeing them, your perspective from the first person, not inside their head. But I need to check that out.
It's very interesting because I thought it from what I could gauge from it is you would necessarily, so this will not be mainly for all the friend or acquaintances. This would be the friend that you really care about.
Yeah.
And it seems as if you will care about them so much that even on your own self, when you look far ahead, you see yourself as a third person. But with a friend, you're so closely connected that even far ahead, friend also looks as if it is only happening.
Right. Yeah. I don't want to say things that article didn't say. Yeah, but that's interesting.
Might not be on the same scale, because this is percentage of participants, but
right.
Near and far itself. So
good point. It's not absolute population. That one on the right might be a much smaller absolute population.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
The signal that you're measuring could be much
right.
much weaker to begin with.
Good point.
So that small delta actually could be significant for the effect.
Right. Yeah.
It is, if you're thinking about a friend, you're thinking about that specific person. If you're thinking about your own future, you're thinking about their surroundings,
right.
not just you.
Right.
Yeah. Is it interesting how many people think of their friends in the first person?
Yeah, I know.
I normally envision friends in the third person.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I mean, I was focusing on the self part of this, right? But there's another story around the friend part of that. Yeah.
So, as we get closer to the future, as the future becomes more of an exponential increase, I think in a way it gets less and less, much more difficult to look. In fact, the ability to look in the future with any reliability becomes shorter and shorter.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you think about the amount of change relative to time, right, and if we buy the case that is increasing, which I don't think it's universal, but I think there are certain domains where it is, then the amount of change within a year might have been the amount of change in 10 years, 100 years ago, right? So if you think about had that branching image, if you think about that, maybe in the Middle Ages, it was more like that. The amount of change that could happen over 100 years was relatively small. Now, it's yawing open where, in a very short amount of time, all of these possibilities now are on the table. And I think, my pet definition of the singularity is when that becomes just a flat, straight line, and then we're through to that. So, yeah.
This reminds me a lot of, you perhaps heard this, maybe Elon Musk who said this, that if we're looking at the singularity, it's time when these entities, we're basically creating something that's going to be potentially infinitely smarter than us, that will have every
Right.
It's on par as if a highly intelligent alien civilization was coming. And if they sent us a note,
Right.
hey, 4 years from now we're coming down, we're highly intelligent, we're going to come over and take over your world.
Right.
We would change drastically our actions.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it's the same situation we're not.
Right. Well, it's kind of the metaphor of the asteroid, right? When it's us, we can't have a lot harder time dealing with that issue than something externally. There's a lot of hands. I want to do my best. So white hat. Yeah. Yeah. You.
This is really what you're saying. I find also when talking to people that people in the tech industry in different disciplines are often unaware of other technologies that people working or developing.
Yeah.
But also I find also because I hang out with a lot of mainly people who don't know anything about this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They're really surprised when I report back from these meetings that I attend like this. They go, really? A lot of people don't know about technology that are presently and imminently shaping society.
Right.
So what have you done anything to try to educate people on a more level plane?
Yeah, I mean, that's the goal. I mean, it's such a hairy problem of systemic change and systemic foresight and civilizational level foresight. I mean, you know, the U.S. used to have the Office of Technology Assessment till Gingrich killed it, and it was an institutionalized way of doing that. There's the Minister of the Future in Sweden that they've created. There's, you know, Singapore does a really good job at a societal level. I have no hope that it's going to happen as a government initiative, but could we do this as some sort of, I mean, are there market forces that we could harness to try to do this? I mean, obviously, in a competitive landscape, you don't really want to give away certain insights. I mean, I work with companies as well. So it's a challenge. I think we need some sort of societal level way of doing this where it's not tied necessarily to a competitive advantage. It's inherently difficult in any society, but especially I think ours, it has become very difficult in the US to do that. I would say just also on the point of seeing other kinds of technologies, this is what we do. We're generalists. You know, I mentioned social scientists and you know, I have certain areas that I focus in, but that's our job, is to connect those dots and do things. You know, Hal Varian at Google talks about combinatorial innovation. So you take, you know, little pieces of things that are happening in biology, in physics, you know, in tech and computers, and you put these things together and you say, what's possible when you mix these things together? And often it's an emergent property that you don't see. Yeah. So one of my favorite activities of the work that we do is expert workshops where we'll get a dozen domain experts together. You know, somebody that studies emergence in ants, or, you know, and somebody that studies high-tech sensor arrays, put them together and say, okay, what kinds of emergent possibilities come out of the intersection of those things that each one of them might not have seen, but together we can see that. Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit more about your work. You know, the slide, a couple slides ahead, it talks about needing the culture can envision the future.
Yeah. Yeah.
That it's headed towards decline.
Right.
And it's really easy to create these Charlie Brooker, you know, dystopian type scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
Have you done any work? Like, I know Neil Stevenson's doing at ASU that kind of future
hieroglyph.
Yeah, trying to project like positive images of the future.
Yeah, I don't think about it myself. So there's a method, I kind of intimated it. We call it alternative futures. So it looks at what we think are 4 generic archetypes of change. So a growth story, a collapse story, what we might call discipline or constraint, and transformation. This is a big leap into a different paradigm. Yeah, and that's, you know, it's one of the methods I've used to how do you make sure that you make different kinds of futures. So I tend less to think about it at this stage of positive or negative. But once that's done, you're supposed to, as part of the process, create your preferred future out of that. So it might, you know, a collapse story might open your mind to a possible future that's still preferred, even though you had to go a certain way to get there. So we want to make sure that we open people's minds to possibility space using the alternative futures, and then they're trying to project a preferred future.
Or the blank branches first and then assign.
Yeah, but if you think about popular culture, like what kind of images we tend to get flooded with, I mean, I don't know what the percentage is, but I would say that a pretty sizable majority tends to be disaster, negative, you know, and does that have an effect? I mean, you know, according to Pollock, yeah, maybe. So do we need to take it upon ourselves to create more positive visions? Those don't really sell movie tickets, right? I mean, Shangri-La, you know, like, yeah. So, you know, how might, I mean, I don't know. Try to think of, I mean, even neutral ones like Arrival was pretty good. You know, I mean, we always work our way out of it, but.
It's also about is the concept global versus local
Like, yeah.
You could say like Star Trek, right. Like not everything about the future has gone awry. Right. But certainly they have conflicts.
Yeah, that's right.
In those
yeah.
4 branches you talked about, there's a woman that needs a drop that did those speculation frameworks that you were mentioning, like the 4 things.
Yeah.
It's a great way to facilitate personal speculations. Take like
yeah, you can apply that at any scale, right? A personal scale, I can give a growth, collapse, discipline, or transformation story of my own life or career. It can work for country. The Soviet Union. We saw a collapse. It wasn't a global collapse. I mean, we tend to talk about these things as global, but yeah, they can scale different ones. So generic images of the futures. Jim Dator, D-A-T-O-R, who created that method. Also, we call them scenario archetypes often. So you can build if you give any topic, somebody could raise anything, beer, and I can give you a coherent set of alternative futures for the future of beer using those archetypes. I really like it for that reason, amongst others. I saw a hand. Well, these are up. We haven't heard from you yet. So no, sorry, yeah, behind.
You're doing a great job of allowing people to visualize, different features.
Yeah.
Right? So, are there any tools that you guys create to help people kind of enact where they want to go for that future?
Yeah, I mean, this is where this is where
I get there. What am I going to do?
Right. Where our level of control begins to weaken at that point, right? So if I'm working with the state of Hawaii, you got to go through all of the mechanisms of state government to take those lessons and put them into action. We saw some things. There was a line now, I don't know what kind of teeth it has to it, but it's in the books now that they are required to think about future generations when they craft policy and make law. So there's little things like that. If I'm working with a company, at that point, it's the strategist often will come in and figure out, okay, how do we operationalize this as well? So I mean, I have certain things, but there's a whole skill set for doing operations and things that come into it, and there's a lot of loss in that handoff. Of course, the McKinseys make a lot more money when they come in and do that. They're smarter, so the level of control that we have is not as much, but we do, we try to provide recommendations and ways to continue this, because the thing that I hate the most is somebody, hires us, we come in, we do something, and then everybody's like, oh, great, okay, we did that, we did the future part now let's go back to business as usual. So what we try to do is institutionalize a foresight process, which, I think will improve the sensing capacity, the reaction time, and then hopefully better strategy comes out of that as well. So that's the main vector that I think we improve institutional processes is to make sure that it's inculcated in an institutional form, ongoing, and not just one-off. Here, and then we'll go here. Yeah.
Relative to this quote, which I love, have you heard of Steven Pinker, his book, That Ranges My Nature? Mm-hmm. I think that book I'm reading right now, it talks very much about what if we were to use statistical analysis as a way of understanding what our future potential is.
I mean, Hans Rosling, those are shockingly positive. Like, things are getting better, right? I mean, this was the amazing thing from the campaign last year. If you look at actual statistical directions of change, things were getting better. The economy, environment, all of these metrics were better. But the story, if you can't tell a story to it, if you can't latch it to a narrative, our brains don't, especially an emotional aspect to it. So, we know who won the emotional side of the debate last year, and that moved enough people. But if you don't have those, like the semantic projections of the future, if you don't have that sort of episodic emotional tie to it, then I don't think you're ever going to be able to actually make deep change. So that's what we're trying to do. All of our stuff has that research behind it, but we just are trying to find ways to make it, punch you in the gut if we have to, but make you care about it and pay attention to it. Yeah.
Taking notes off your discussion, I want to get you 2.5. There is a management strategy that's called doubt. And then the other thing is there's this process of human behavior called neurocodification that guides us. The large forward portion population just is intrinsically geared to this. And I think what has happened is that we have gotten locked into very old ideas. Like when you showed that chart, that radial chart, it was a 2D Cartesian system. These are much more complicated. And not necessarily complicated as hard to do, but alien. We the ideas we have don't adapt to the situations
All right.
that come up. And one of the ways I can think of this is that one of the ways you can deal with filling in for the future is using a mental illness called confabulation, where you can't distinguish between the reality of your thoughts and what's happening, but that becomes
Yeah, right. I mean, where are these new ideas going to be generated? Not just ideas. I mean, sometimes we talk about, a lot of this doesn't work on the register of what we sometimes call epistemological rupture. We're actually trying to make people think about how they generate their reality differently. Can't always get into that level of depth in some of these projects, but that's part of our goal as well, is to create new ways of thinking out of that. And so, yeah, non-typical, non-neurotypical ways of thinking can generate. I think that's where a big portion of our new ideas come from, people that don't think like. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Amygdala has a tendency to shut down the higher cognitive functions. That's a big part of what's going on.
Right.
Do you have a copy of your slides available for download?
Yeah, they're in various forms. Some of these in different places, but I'll make them available. I have to go back and check rights on some of the images I use, but yeah.
And we distribute a video of this talk as well, so if anybody got the email, we'll send out an email and you'll see the YouTube link.
Maybe we'll do two more. Kevin, and then yeah.
Sorry, I just had one more question I wanted to ask, which is I come from the world of software development, and there's a similar problem in software development to sort of what you talk about, this accelerating rate of change, proliferation of the future, namely that literally the very tools and systems that we build our code on are all changing faster and faster, so nobody can keep up anymore. Right. And there's design methodologies like called Agile or DevOps to deal with this. Specifically, the idea is that you're always iteratively improving your model, improving the process. I'm curious if futurists have thought of adapting some of these techniques to constantly be iterative on their models to adapt to the ever-increasing rate of change.
You mean the models that we use?
Yeah, I mean, it's like going literally every 2 weeks you tweak the model based on the news stories of that week. Yes, in a way. Like we're always. I mean, I think futures, because we're always having to explain ourselves and go back to first principles. We often are very much always kind of thinking again about does this work? But also just because this is not a one-way street. This futures, as you can tell, it's collaboratively created, and it's a relationship, it's a conversation. So the mental models of the people in the room are critical to what kind of tools you use, how you deploy those tools. And so, the world we live in now, where we're getting buffeted by highly disruptive news every day, that now becomes part of the situation that we have to account for when we do futures work. So yeah, we're if not fully innovating on every method, those things look radically different depending on the context we work with, not only the clients, but the sort of mental situation. There's a great quote from my advisor, Jim Dater. He calls it the crackpot realism of the present. So we imagine the future in terms of what's happening around us. And so we have to, that could be a blinder, it could be a bias, but as a facilitator and a practitioner, everything we have to do is try to break people out of habits of thought or blinders that the present has put on us. And we're always working with that. So the tools we use, the techniques, are a big part of it is attempting to break through that pattern. Yeah.
Yeah, and really moved by this quote. And I find it very, very inspiring and beautiful. And part of what moves me about it is when I read, society's image is positive and flourishing, I think you could substitute not just society, but you could put city, you could substitute a lot of different things. And my background, I came with my husband, who's more tech-oriented though, but what I've been studying is developmental psychology. What I find so interesting when I read this quote is thinking about the role of myth and art and story and symbol. And that's what I'm hearing in this, is when we don't have stories and myths and symbols that really speak to the flourishing image that we hold for ourselves, for our cultures, for our families, for our world. And that's part of, I'm just really curious if you've paired with artists or thinking about ways of how do we create and rebirth those positive myths and story
Yeah.
to hold that mirror of the image that then can really help facilitate those possibilities.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. You know, you can throw facts at people all day, and it doesn't move the needle of change or their mindset. So, I mean, it looks obvious in retrospect, but it didn't come about this way. But being trained in anthropology and visual anthropology, you know, how people represent themselves to each other, how abstract ideas are created. I wrote my master's thesis on fake documentary. This was in 2000. So how does documentary film create a sense of truth using the way it's edited, voiceover narratives, you know, the camera angle, all of these things create truth. So these are now, I mean, I would think of them as tools. So how do we use myth? How do we use rite of passage? How do we use a city's mythology? So Austin, so I'm gonna do a 1-minute pitch for an idea and plant the seed. So I want to create, even if it's not, even if Adler doesn't put this in official office, but I want to create an office of the weird, WYRD. So the original meaning of weird is portents of the future, right? This is like the winds of change that are coming. So it has a future orientation to it already. So Austin being weird, I want to create kind of a pseudo shadow public office that is geared toward creating images of the future for Austin and putting them out into the world. That's one vision of it, but using that mythology to generate. I mean, you have to use what's there, right? In many cases, so you can't use, keep Birmingham weird. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama. It's not going to work, right? See, it's very specific culturally and place-based, but those are all just like facts and the environment and the people that are there. That mythological trajectory, that mythological reservoir is critical for making this connect to a place and to people that live in the place. Yeah, thanks. Fred Polak is an amazing scholar. He was basically invented future studies. He wrote, he was a Dutch Jew hiding out from the Nazis, and then was thinking about this and wrote this book, kind of this, epitome of futures work right after World War II. And it has been the kind of almost the founding document of future studies from the more social science, philosophical side of things, not necessarily the militaristic wargaming side of things. But yeah, really important person in our work, and I'm glad that resonated with you. Yeah, last question.
We're advancing so much technologically, and that's only going to snowball or accelerate.
Maybe.
But here's somebody who's having to hide for his life.
Yeah.
And don't seem to have made much progress since then, but the era of weapons of mass destruction started at the end.
Right.
World War II, World War I, and how now little countries where somebody seems appears as an currency in nuts.
Well, that's where I think the depression quote is, or the insight about depression, that it's not past trauma, it's future dread or future darkness that is the biggest problem. So I think we can overcome, if we're honest, any trauma from the past, even what we're going through now, but not without something that pulls us forward. If all we see is dread, especially if all we see is dread with our technological prowess to destroy the planet, I have a lot of fear. I will say, just on the point of Black Mirror, not to say that everything negative is negative. There is a thing called self-defeating prophecies. So seeing what this actually might look like is critically important. So yeah, I think we should amp up the sort of positive, rich, positive visions of the future, but I don't think there's anything wrong necessarily with dark ones if we are using it to learn, and that feedback loop is.
Where did you pass away?
Oh, I think in the early 80s. Yeah.
Because, somebody just killed a bunch of kids, what I mean? They never met.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's the initial quote, things are getting better and better and worse, faster and faster. If you want to take a worse and worse, when we can sit here and all of us come up with 10 in 2 seconds, right, of things that are getting worse. But there are things that are getting better, right? We got to remember that too. We got to keep remembering that. Yeah.
The mind is like exponentially more focused on negative events. It is inclined to do so.
All right.
Up to us to balance that by actually over focusing on the reality of the goodness.
Right. Yeah, and not stopping at the moment of fear, right? And to say, you know, Stumbling on Happiness is a great book about affective forecasting by Dan Gilbert. And one of the things he talks about is, you know, people project forward. Oh, I'm going to be happy if I'm CEO of this company, and you know, we're invariably terrible at that. But the other side of that is like if you ask somebody, you know, would I be happy if I lost a limb? And at the moment, people think about that moment. They think about the present. This is the presentism that we get locked in. Okay, the moment I lose that is something I've lost. They don't think about 5 years later when you've become accustomed to that, or you have a prosthetic or whatever. Like, go talk to the people that have a prosthetic arm. If they're happy, it's a better indication of whether you're going to be happy rather than you trying to project forward. So there are ways to get over some of our biases, and I think we're learning that now. It's kind of exciting in that sense. But yeah, balance, making sure that we're at least attending to positive futures so we have that pull of something, not just getting stuck on the negative and stopping the thinking. That's what we don't want to avoid. Last comment, I know you had your hand up for a second.
It's not all bad in Black Mirror. I just want to make a point.
Yeah.
Season 3 there's an episode titled Staring to Your Hero, and it tackles mind uploading. So it's pretty
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, I mean, as far as our images of the future and how they resonate with society, Black Mirror has few that equal that. But I think just general culture. I mean, in my world, I found that everyone is talking about Black Mirror. I sign it in my classes now too. So yeah. All right. Okay. Well, go create some images of the future. If you want to join the Office of the Weird, whenever that happens, keep an eye out for that. I'm going to make sure that you can only communicate by nailing things to walls in the city. So I've got some weird rules that I'm already putting in place. But thanks for your time. Thanks for coming out.